Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to dissect the actual constitutional mechanics behind some of the UK's most explosive modern legal battles. We're looking at this fascinating, centuries-old tug-of-war between the government and parliament. And, right at the very heart of this conflict is a concept known as the Royal Prerogative. I know, it sounds incredibly medieval, and, well, in many ways it actually is. But as we'll see, it recently sparked these massive, university-level constitutional stress tests in the highest courts of the land. Here's our roadmap for today's intellectual journey. First, we'll look at the Crown's residue. Second, the bedrock rule. Third, Miller I and triggering Article 50. Fourth, Miller II and the suspension of Parliament. And finally, we'll wrap up with the modern constitutional balance. All right, Section 1, the Crown's residue. Before we can really understand those modern crises, we've got to understand the foundational powers at play. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that word residue. As defined by the legendary constitutional theorist A.V. Dicey way back in 1885, the royal prerogative isn't some fresh power granted by modern statutes. No, it is literally the leftover, unwritten power from a time of absolute monarchs. Think about it. Before the UK even had a modern parliament, the crown basically possessed absolute sovereignty. So today, what remains of that original kind of arbitrary authority is exactly what we call the prerogative. So what does this ancient residue actually let the government do today? Honestly, quite a lot. We're talking about massive, real-world responsibilities, managing foreign affairs, making and breaking international treaties, deploying armed forces overseas. It even covers things like granting pardons, issuing passports, and proroguing, which just means suspending, Parliament. But here's the absolute crucial modern reality we need to keep in mind. While the monarch holds the legal responsibility on paper, it's actually the Prime Minister and government ministers who pull these levers today. Moving right along to Section 2, the bedrock rule. Let's establish the rules of the game here. Here we have the ultimate constitutional heavyweight matchup. On one side, you've got the executive, the government, using the royal prerogative to basically run foreign policy and make treaties on the international stage. But on the other side, you have the legislature, Parliament, and Parliament possesses absolute sovereignty. That means only Parliament has the supreme, unquestionable right to make, unmake, or alter domestic statutory law. The centuries-old tension we're analyzing today, it's exactly this dynamic. The executive pushing the boundaries of its prerogative, and the legislature pushing back to assert its ultimate sovereignty. Let's move to this timeline and see how this builds. Historically, the royal prerogative has just been steadily chipped away by Parliament over centuries. Back in 1611, the case of proclamations established that nope, the monarch cannot just create new law by decree. In 1689, the Bill of Rights firmly subjected crown powers to the law. Fast forward a bit to 1972, and Parliament passes the European Communities Act, literally weaving EU rights directly into UK domestic law. And that sets the stage perfectly for the massive constitutional clash we saw in 2017 with the Miller I case. Which brings us to Section 3, Miller I and triggering Article 50. And I want to be super clear right up front. We are looking purely at the constitutional mechanics here, absolutely not the politics of Brexit. So, here's the million-dollar question. Can the executive trigger Article 50, the formal mechanism to leave the European Union, using the royal prerogative, totally bypassing Parliament? Theresa May's government reasoned, well, yeah, triggering Article 50 is about an international treaty, so it falls squarely under our historical prerogative power to handle treaties on the world stage. But take a look at page 15 of the actual Supreme Court judgment here. It provides this incredible foundational reminder of parliamentary sovereignty. It clearly reiterates that ever since the 17th century, it's been a fundamental bedrock principle of the UK Constitution that the Crown simply cannot change any part of the common law or statute law without Parliament saying so. Ultimately, the Supreme Court had to decide if the government's treaty-making prerogative could bypass Parliament in this specific, highly charged instance. And the results? An 8-3 majority decision firmly against the government. They ruled it was completely unlawful for the executive to trigger Article 50 unilaterally. So, the crucial point is mathematically elegant, really. Think about it. The 1972 European Communities Act was a statute passed by Parliament, right? And it created real, tangible domestic rights for UK citizens. Because triggering Article 50 would inevitably destroy those statutory rights, the royal prerogative just couldn't be used. Prerogative power cannot undo statutory law. Only an act of Parliament could authorize that kind of change. All right, on to the next stress test. Section 4, Miller II, suspending Parliament. This brings up our next massive constitutional question. Can the Prime Minister use the prerogative to prorogue, or suspend, Parliament for 5 whole weeks? Remember, during the absolute height of the Brexit crisis, Parliament was actively trying to prevent a no-deal departure. So in response, Boris Johnson's government advised the Queen to suspend Parliament. The government's argument? They basically said, look, this is just a standard political maneuver. It's entirely within the bounds of the Royal Prerogative, and therefore it's something the courts literally cannot touch. But once again, the judiciary stepped in, and this time the Supreme Court ruled unanimously. All 11 judges agreed that advising the Queen to prorogue Parliament for that length of time, especially in those circumstances, was fundamentally unlawful and void. The court intervened because this executive action basically had the effect of frustrating or totally preventing Parliament from carrying out its constitutional functions without any reasonable justification. The justices really anchored their decision in a concept that is just as vital as parliamentary sovereignty, and that is parliamentary accountability. You see, the UK government is a parliamentary government. Its entire right to exist springs from commanding the confidence of the House of Commons, so it has to submit to scrutiny. The Supreme Court basically pointed out that the longer Parliament stands suspended, the greater the risk that responsible government is replaced by totally unaccountable government. A 5-week suspension during a major national crisis, that fundamentally threatened the entire democratic model. Which perfectly leads us into Section 5, the modern constitutional balance. Let's synthesize all of this. Let's summarize these stress tests. On one side, Miller I checked the treaty power to uphold parliamentary sovereignty. On the other side, Miller II checked the power to suspend the legislature to uphold parliamentary accountability. And this brilliantly illustrates how these judgments, even though they were incredibly controversial at the time, they weren't about reinventing the law. Actually, scratch that. They were really a profound reaffirmation of classic orthodox British constitutional principles. The courts simply refused to let ancient prerogative powers bypass modern democratic accountability. Page 18 of the Miller judgment really highlights a vital concept for dualist legal systems like the UK. Treaties are not self-executing. Sure, the government can sign whatever it wants abroad under the prerogative, but the exact moment that signature affects domestic legal rights at home, the executive's power hits a brick wall, and Parliament's power has to begin. The prerogative, quite simply, is never a blank check. Which leaves us with this final, honestly kind of provocative thought. If the Supreme Court had decided differently, if they had ruled that the royal prerogative could indeed alter domestic law in Miller I, or that the PM could just suspend Parliament indefinitely without judicial review in Miller II, what would actually stop a government from ruling entirely by decree? These cases remind us that the separation of powers isn't just some abstract academic theory you learn in a textbook. It's the vital, active machinery that keeps a democracy functioning. It ensures that no one, literally not even the highest executive authority, is above the law. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.